The champagne glass shattered against Italian marble, $3,000 worth of crystal, spreading like guilt across the floor of a Manhattan penthouse that cost more per month than most people earn in a year. "You expect me to believe," she whispered, her voice trembling between rage and something far more dangerous, "that the man who just wired $500,000 to protect me is the same man whose world I should run from." Darius didn't move, didn't flinch. The city glittered 40 stories below them like scattered diamonds, and somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed a reminder that trust, in his world, was the most expensive currency of all. What happens when the only person who can save you is the one person you're not sure you should trust? Before we dive into this story, and trust me, you're going to want to hear every single word hit that subscribe button. Because what unfolds in the next 40 minutes? Let's just say it's the kind of truth that changes everything you thought you knew about power, protection, and the price of both. Let me take you back 3 months. Atlantic City on a Tuesday night in October, the kind of evening where the ocean wind cuts through even the best wool coat, and the boardwalk empties out, except for the desperate and the determined. Sienna Hartwell was neither. She was something else entirely. At 32, she'd built her reputation as a forensic accountant the hard way, tracking money through corporate labyrinths that would make most people's heads spin. Princeton education, CPA, a client list that included 3 Fortune 500 companies. The kind of woman who wore Armani to depositions and kept her personal life so private that even her closest friends knew only what she allowed. She didn't gamble, didn't drink much, didn't do spontaneous. But her firm had sent her to audit the Royal Atlantic, a casino resort that moved more money in a weekend than some countries see in a year. Something in their books didn't add up. $7 million, to be precise, disappearing into accounts that existed on paper but nowhere else. Ghost accounts, her boss had called them. Find the ghosts. She'd found them, all right. And in doing so, she'd found something far more dangerous. Darius Kincaid didn't own the Royal Atlantic on paper. On paper, it belonged to a consortium of international investors with names that sounded like law firms. But anyone who knew anything, anyone who understood how real power moved in this country, knew that Big Boss Darius held the strings. 63 years old, 6'3". The kind of presence that made rooms go quiet not from fear, but from respect. He wore custom 3-piece suits from a tailor in London who dressed 3 generations of old money, drove a 1967 Shelby GT, 500 worth $500,000 that he kept in a climate-controlled garage in the Hamptons alongside a Bugatti Chiron and a Rolls-Royce Phantom that once belonged to a Saudi prince. They met on a Thursday. She'd been expecting lawyers, conference rooms, the corporate dance of denial and deflection. Instead, she got Darius himself, in his private office overlooking the Atlantic, with floor-to-ceiling windows that made you feel like you were floating above the world. "Miss Hartwell," he'd said, his voice like aged bourbon, smooth, dark, with a burn that came after. "I understand you've been looking for ghosts." The thing about Darius that surprised her, that caught her completely off guard, was his directness. No games. No corporate doublespeak. He'd looked at her findings, nodded slowly, and said, "You're right. Those accounts are problematic." "Problematic?" She'd raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Kincaid, that's $7 million in what appears to be money laundering activity. That's not problematic. That's federal prison." He'd smiled then. Not the smile of a man caught, but the smile of a man who'd been waiting for someone smart enough to catch him. "Miss Hartwell, let me tell you something about the world you've just stumbled into. Those accounts, they don't belong to me. They belong to people who use my businesses as, let's call them transit points. People who don't appreciate being discovered." The way he said it made her skin prickle. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm protecting you." He'd leaned back in his chair, Italian leather that probably cost more than her car. "The moment you filed that preliminary report to your firm, you became visible. And visibility, in certain circles, is the most dangerous thing you can be. She should have walked out. Should have gone straight to the FBI. Should have done 100 things differently. Instead, she'd asked, "What people?" And that's when everything changed. Over the next 2 weeks, Darius explained a world she'd only glimpsed in spreadsheets. The Royale Atlantic wasn't just a casino. It was a crossroads. International businessmen, some legitimate, some decidedly not, used it to move money across borders. Art dealers, real estate developers, cryptocurrency traders, and yes, sometimes people connected to organizations that didn't file tax returns or hold annual shareholder meetings. "I don't touch the money," Darius had told her over dinner at a private restaurant in Manhattan where they didn't have menus. The chef just brought what was best that day. "But I know whose money it is. And that knowledge, that's what keeps me valuable. That's what keeps me breathing." "Why are you telling me this?" she'd asked, watching him across the table. Lobster risotto, neither of them was touching, a bottle of wine that cost more than most people's mortgage payment. "Because you're in danger, Sienna. And because—" He'd paused, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Because I haven't met someone worth protecting in a very long time." The word worth hung between them like a promise and a threat. She'd learned things about him in those weeks. How he'd grown up in South Philadelphia, the son of a factory worker and a schoolteacher. How he'd built his first fortune in commercial real estate in his 30s. Legitimate, legal, clean. How he'd pivoted into hospitality, then gaming, then other things. Things that existed in the gray spaces where law became negotiable. But she'd also learned about the philanthropy. The scholarship fund for inner-city kids that had sent 200 students to college. The community center in North Philly that bore his mother's name. The way he quietly paid medical bills for families who couldn't afford them. The way he'd once bought an entire city block to prevent gentrification from displacing a historically black neighborhood. "You're a walking contradiction," she'd told him one night on his yacht, a 120-foot azimut named Second Chances, docked in Jersey. "I'm a pragmatist," he'd corrected, pouring her cognac that was older than she was. "The world isn't black and white, Sienna. It's 1,000 shades of gray. And the people who survive are the ones who learn to navigate all of them." She'd started to fall for him then. Not just for the money, though, God. The money was intoxicating. The private jet to Paris for lunch. The front row seats to shows that were sold out for months. The way he'd once closed down Tiffany's for an hour so she could browse without interruption. No, it was simpler than that, and more complex. It was the way he listened when she talked about her work. The way he asked questions about her life, her sister who taught kindergarten in Ohio, her father's jazz collection, the novel she'd been trying to write since college. The way he made her feel seen in a world that often reduced her to her credentials. But then came the night that changed everything. November in New York hits different when you're standing in front of a police precinct at 2 a.m., watching federal agents walk out with boxes of files. Sienna had been at Darius's penthouse, his main residence on Park Avenue, the kind of place where the doorman wore white gloves and knew everyone by name. They'd been watching a classic film, Casablanca, because Darius loved the old movies, said they understood something about honor that modern films missed. His phone had buzzed. Once, twice, then continuously. The look that crossed his face made her blood run cold. "I need to make a call," he'd said, already standing, already moving to his study. She'd heard pieces, fragments. How many? And federal or local? And finally, terrifyingly, secure everything. Now, when he came back, his face was a mask. "Sienna, I need you to listen very carefully. In about 6 hours, your firm is going to be raided. Federal agents. They're looking for the forensic analysis you did on the Royale Atlantic accounts, and they're going to find it." "How do you know?" "Because I have people who tell me things." He'd crossed to the bar, poured scotch with steady hands. "The people I warned you about, the ones whose money you discovered, they've decided you're a liability. They've fed information to the FBI. They're going to make it look like you were complicit in the laundering, that you helped hide the money instead of exposing it." She'd felt the room tilt. That's insane! I have documentation, emails, time-stamped files, which can be altered, backdated, made to look like you were covering your tracks. He'd turned to face her, and in his eyes was something she couldn't quite name. Sienna, they're going to destroy you. Your career, your freedom, everything. Unless what? Unless you disappear. The word hung in the air like smoke. You're asking me to run? I'm asking you to let me protect you. He'd crossed to her, taken her hands in his large, warm, scarred across the knuckles, in ways that suggested his early life hadn't been all tailored suits and charity galas. I have resources, safe houses, lawyers who can fight this. But it takes time, and you don't have time if you stay visible. She'd pulled her hands away. This is insane. I go to the FBI myself. I tell them everything. I'm the whistleblower, Darius. I'm the one who found the crime. You're the one who found their crime. There's a difference. His voice had gone hard. Sienna, these people don't play by rules, you understand. They don't care about evidence or justice. They care about protecting their money. And right now, you're the threat to that money. And you're what? My knight in shining armor? She'd heard the bitterness in her own voice. The man with mafia connections is going to save me from the mafia? He'd flinched. Actually flinched. It was the first time she'd seen him show real hurt. I have never lied to you about what I am, he'd said quietly. I've never pretended to be something clean and simple. But I have also never, not once, let anyone under my protection come to harm. Never. I don't need protection. I need... Her phone had exploded with notifications, text messages, emails. Her boss, call me, immediately. Her colleague, what the hell did you do? A number she didn't recognize. You should have kept your nose in your own business. Her hands had started shaking. Darius had taken the phone gently from her grip, read the messages, and his face had gone cold in a way that actually frightened her. Pack a bag, he'd said. We're leaving. Now. I'm not going anywhere until you explain. Sienna. He'd gripped her shoulders, forced her to look at him. In 3 hours, there will be agents at your apartment. In 6 hours, there will be a warrant for your arrest. In 12 hours, you'll be in federal custody, and these people will have won. Or, his voice had softened, or, you trust me, just for tonight. Just long enough to let me make some calls and figure out who set you up and how we prove your innocence. She'd wanted to argue, wanted to call a lawyer, call her sister, call someone who existed in the normal world where problems had normal solutions. But something in his eyes, something beyond the wealth and the power and the dangerous connections, made her nod. They'd left the penthouse through a service entrance. Not his Shelby, but a nondescript BMW that one of his security team had waiting. Drove through the Lincoln Tunnel, then north, then into darkness that could have been anywhere. The safe house turned out to be a farmhouse in upstate New York. 2 hours from Manhattan, but feeling like a different century. Stone walls, a fireplace that actually worked, security cameras hidden in trees that she only noticed because Darius pointed them out. No one knows about this place except 3 people, he'd told her, starting a fire against the November chill. You're safe here. Safe! She'd laughed, but it came out hollow. My whole life just imploded, and you're using words like safe. He'd poured her brandy, sat across from her. And then he'd said the thing that broke through her shock. I'm going to fix this, Sienna, I promise you. But I need you to understand something first. What? The people who did this? They know about us. About you and me. They're using that, making it look like you were my accomplice, that I paid you to hide the accounts, not expose them. Her stomach had dropped. That's why the messages. Why my boss. Why everyone thinks you're dirty. Yes. He'd leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Which means, to clear your name, I have to expose things about my world that I've kept hidden for 20 years. I have to burn bridges with people who don't forget and don't forgive. I have to... Why would you do that? The question came out as a whisper. You barely know me. The look he gave her, then, God. She'd never forget it. Because some things are worth burning the world down for. The next 72 hours taught Sienna things about Darius that no amount of dinners or yacht trips ever could have revealed. He made calls, dozens of them, to lawyers who spoke in careful code, to people whose names he never said out loud, to someone he called only Judge, who apparently owed him a favor from 1997 involving a real estate deal in Detroit and a senator's son. She watched him work the phones like a conductor leading an orchestra, threatening here, cajoling there, reminding someone of an old debt, promising someone else a future favor. You're calling in every chip you have. She'd realized on the second day, watching him hang up from what looked like a particularly difficult conversation. Yes, for me, for justice, he'd corrected. But yes, for you. His tech guy, a woman named Jade, who looked like she belonged at a fashion startup, not hunched over laptops running code, Sienna couldn't begin to understand, arrived that afternoon. We need to prove the accounts were active before Sienna ever looked at them, Darius had explained. Need to show the money trail leading back to the real players. Need to... I know what we need, boss, Jade had interrupted, not looking up from her screens. Give me 48 hours and warrant-proof documentation that the feds can't ignore. While they worked, Sienna made her own calls. To her sister, who was terrified and furious in equal measure. To a lawyer friend from college, who specialized in white-collar crime and who'd nearly choked when Sienna explained the situation. You need to come in, the lawyer had insisted. Running makes you look guilty. Staying makes me an easy target. For who? Sienna, what are you not telling me? Everything, she'd thought. I'm not telling you everything. On the third night, over takeout Chinese food that Darius's security guy had picked up from a place 40 miles away, operational security, they'd called it, she'd finally asked the question that had been burning in her chest. Why do you do it? The gray area work. You have legitimate money, legitimate businesses. You don't need control, he'd said simply. Information. The kind of leverage that keeps powerful people from getting too comfortable. He'd set down his chopsticks. You think the world runs on laws, Sienna? It doesn't. It runs on power. And sometimes the only way to protect the powerless is to have more power than the people trying to hurt them. That's a rationalization. That's reality. He'd met her eyes. I've kept 3 city councilmen honest by knowing where their dirty money comes from. I've stopped 2 real estate developments that would have displaced 1,000 families. You've also made millions from money you know is dirty. Yes. No hesitation. No justification. Just yes. I have. And I've used those millions to do more good than I could have done staying clean. That's the compromise I made. That's the man I am. She'd wanted to argue. Wanted to tell him he was wrong, that there had to be a better way. But then Jade had shouted from the other room. Got it. Holy shit, boss. You're going to want to see this. What Jade had found was a digital paper trail that read like a John Grisham novel. The $7 million didn't originate at the Royal Atlantic. It came from a shell corporation in the Caymans, moved through 3 banks in 2 countries, and ended up in accounts that were opened by someone with access to Sienna's personal information, social security number, mother's maiden name. The works. Identity theft? Sienna had breathed. Frame job, Jade corrected. Someone set up these accounts in your name before you ever started the audit. They were planning this from the beginning. Darius had gone very still. Who opened them? Jade pulled up a name. A signature. A face Sienna recognized immediately. Kenneth Hartford, senior partner at her firm, the man who'd assigned her the audit in the first place. Oh my God, Sienna whispered. He set you up, Darius said, his voice cold enough to frost glass. Sent you in to find the accounts he'd already created in your name. When you exposed them, you'd expose yourself. Perfect crime. But why? Why would he? Because someone paid him to. Jade pulled up more files. See these transfers? $250,000 to his personal account last month, from the same Cayman corporation. Sienna felt sick. He sold me out. He tried to, Darius corrected. He pulled out his phone. Time to make this right. What happened next happened fast. Darius called the judge he'd spoken to before, explained the situation, sent Jade's documentation through encrypted channels. Within 6 hours, there were federal investigators in Kenneth Hartford's office with questions he couldn't answer. Within 12 hours, the warrant for Sienna's arrest was withdrawn. Within 24 hours, Kenneth Hartford was the one in custody. And the real players behind the money laundering, an international syndicate that Darius refused to name, but that the news later called one of the largest financial crime operations in decades, were scrambling to hide. "You did it," Sienna had said, watching the news from the farmhouse. "You actually did it. We did it." Darius had handed her a glass of the good scotch. "You found the crime. I just helped people see what was really there." She'd taken the scotch, taken a sip. Let the burn ground her. This is what you do, isn't it? This is what all of it's for. The connections, the gray areas, the power you keep talking about. Yes. And the cost? He'd looked at her then, really looked at her, and she'd seen something in his face that she hadn't noticed before. Loneliness. The kind that comes from standing between worlds, belonging fully to neither. The cost, he'd said quietly, is that people like you, good people, honest people, look at me and wonder if I'm worth trusting. Which brought them to that night. The penthouse. The champagne glass breaking against Italian marble. "You expect me to believe," Sienna had said, her voice trembling, "that the man who just wired $500,000 to protect me is the same man whose world I should run from?" Darius hadn't moved, hadn't tried to touch her or convince her or do any of the things a lesser man might have done. Instead, he'd said, "No, I don't expect you to believe anything. I'm giving you a choice. A choice. You can walk away. Tonight. Right now. I'll have my lawyers make sure Hartford's cooperation includes clearing your name completely. I'll have my security team watch over you from a distance for the next 6 months until we're sure no one's coming after you for revenge. I'll disappear from your life like I was never there. Or you stay. You let me show you the rest of the world I live in, the good and the bad, the beautiful and the ugly. You decide for yourself whether a man who's done the things I've done can still be worth your trust. Worth your—" he'd paused, "worth your heart." She'd picked up her coat, put it on, walked to the elevator. He'd watched her go without a word. Without begging or bargaining or making promises he might not be able to keep. Her finger had hovered over the button. Ground floor. Exit. Back to her old life. Or what was left of it. She'd thought about Princeton. About building her career one audit at a time, one ethical decision after another. About doing things the right way, the clean way, the way her father had taught her. She'd thought about Kenneth Hartford, who'd worn the right suits and said the right things and had sold her out for $250,000 without blinking. She'd thought about Darius, who'd never pretended to be anything other than what he was, and who'd burned half his world down to keep her safe. The elevator had waited. Patient, mechanical, uncaring. She'd pressed a button, but not the one he expected. The doors had closed. The elevator had moved. Up. When she'd walked back into the penthouse, Darius had been standing exactly where she'd left him, looking out over the Manhattan skyline like a king surveying his complicated kingdom. "I can't trust you," she'd said. He'd turned, nodded. "I know. I don't know if I'll ever be able to fully trust you, because I don't know where your world ends and the dangerous parts begin. I don't know when you're protecting me and when you're protecting your interests. I don't know—" "I know," he'd said again. But she'd crossed to him, stood close enough to feel the heat of him, the solid reality of him. "But I trust the way you protect, the way you show up, the way you don't make promises you can't keep, and don't pretend to be something you're not." His hand had come up. cupped her face with a gentleness that seemed impossible from someone with his kind of power. "That's enough," he'd whispered. "That's more than enough." They'd stayed like that, two people from different worlds, finding something like solid ground in each other, while the city glittered below and the night stretched out with all its possibilities and dangers. 3 months later, Sienna took a position as an independent consultant specializing in financial crime investigation. Her first major case involved tracking money for a non-profit that Darius had funded, completely legitimate, completely clean, but requiring the kind of forensic expertise that only someone who'd seen both sides of the fence could provide. She moved into the penthouse. Not full-time, she kept her apartment in Brooklyn, kept her independence, kept her ability to walk away if the world he lived in ever became too much. But most nights, she was there, learning the balance between the man he was in public and the man he was in private. Learning which of his associates were dangerous and which were just survivors. Learning that power, like everything else, was a tool and that the person wielding it mattered more than the tool itself. Darius kept his word about everything. The protection, the honesty, the refusal to pull her into anything that would compromise the ethics she'd built her life on. But he also showed her things she'd never imagined. Not just the wealth, though, God, that was intoxicating. The private concerts, the weekend trips to places most people only see in magazines, the way he could call in favors that moved mountains. No, it was the other stuff. The way he'd show up at community centers in North Philly, roll up his sleeves, and help renovate buildings. The way he'd sit with kids from the scholarship program and tell them stories about failure and resilience. The way he'd once spent an entire Sunday negotiating with city officials to save a public library from budget cuts. "You're a vigilante," she'd told him once, "with better suits and a really expensive car." He'd laughed. Actually laughed. "I'm a pragmatist with a conscience." There's a difference. Is there? Ask me in 20 years. She intended to. Because here's the thing about trust, it's not binary. It's not a switch you flip from off to on. It's a muscle you build, one choice at a time, one day at a time, one moment of showing up when it would be easier to walk away. And Darius? He kept showing up. Not perfect, not clean, not the fairy tale version of a hero that little girls are taught to wait for, but real and present. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was everything. So here's my question for you. Could you do it? Could you trust someone whose world exists in those gray spaces between right and wrong? Could you love someone who's done things you'd never do but for reasons you might understand? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if this story hit you the way it hit me, if you felt every moment of Sienna's impossible choice, hit that like button and subscribe. Because trust me, there are more stories from Darius's world, more impossible choices. More moments where power meets principle, and someone has to decide what they're willing to compromise and what they're willing to protect. I'll see you in the next one.